So when you think about the war in Ukraine, your mind probably jumps straight to the battlefields in Europe, right? But the shock waves from this thing, man, they're traveling way, way further. It's actually kicking off this massive global realignment. Okay, let's get into it.
It's so easy to frame this whole thing as a simple two-sided story. You know, the West on one side, Russia on the other. But is it really that black and white? The reality, as we're about to see, is a whole lot messier, with a lot more players on the board.
Right, so here's the big idea for this explainer. Think of the war as a global stress test. It's not creating new problems out of thin air, but it's shining a massive spotlight on deep divisions that were already lurking under the surface. And it's hitting the fast-forward button on a major shift in world power. Okay, let's start with that first ripple. We're going to look at the Western Alliance. Now, you might think it's this totally solid, unified bloc, right? But if you look just a little closer, you start to see some pretty serious cracks appearing.
And look, on the surface, the main Western position is crystal clear, and it has been from day one. It's all about unwavering support for Ukraine, hitting Russia with sweeping economic sanctions, keeping a continuous supply of military aid flowing, and basically trying to isolate Moscow on the world stage.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Check out the contrast on this slide. Inside NATO itself, you've got outliers like Hungary and Turkey. While pretty much everyone else is focused on a military victory for Ukraine, these two are saying, nope, there's no military solution here. They're pushing for negotiations, rejecting the whole sanctions-first plan, and deliberately keeping those diplomatic and energy lines open to Moscow. That's a huge split. And this quote from Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban just nails it. He says, "If there is no solution in the battlefield, then peace must be established." See, he's not just questioning the tactics here. He's throwing out the entire premise that this war can actually be won militarily. So here's the thing you gotta understand. This isn't just some polite disagreement over coffee. What we're actually seeing is this power axis forming inside the West. These countries are pushing for what they call strategic autonomy. They're basically saying that their own sovereign governments, not just NATO or Brussels, should be the ones calling the shots for their own future. All right, let's follow that ripple outwards. We're going to zoom out now and look at two absolute giants on the world stage, China and India. And what are they doing? They haven't picked a side. Instead, they're walking this incredibly careful, calculated tightrope. And that brings us right back to this key term you see on the screen, strategic autonomy. Indian officials have been super clear about this. They say their foreign policy is all about this idea and their own national interest. It's this principle that a country should be free to do what's best for itself, rather than just falling in line with one bloc or another. Honestly, this one concept is the key to understanding not just China and India, but also what Hungary and Turkey are doing. And you can see this policy playing out so clearly on this timeline. I mean, right from the start, both China and India sat on their hands during UN votes to condemn Russia. And that wasn't just a one-time thing. It was followed up by these big, high-profile visits to Moscow, and all the while trade is booming, especially with them buying up discounted Russian energy. That's a huge economic lifeline for Russia. It's a very consistent pattern of behavior. And listen, the person feeling the impact of this the most is, of course, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. He's pointed it out himself. He basically said that without the Chinese market, Russia would be facing total economic collapse. And you can see the direct result of this on the ground in Ukraine. Public opinion has just plummeted. According to a poll from early 2024, a massive 72.5% of Ukrainians now have a negative view of China. It just goes to show you their position isn't being seen as neutral at all. It's being seen as pro-Russian. And that frustration isn't just aimed at China. It extends to India too. When Prime Minister Modi made that trip to Moscow in 2024, Zelensky was blunt. He called it a huge disappointment and a devastating blow. For Ukraine, seeing these world leaders embracing Putin feels like it completely undermines the global effort to stop the war. Okay, so now let's pull the camera back one last time for the big picture. Because the moves that China, India, and Russia are making, they aren't just isolated decisions. They're actually part of this much larger, coordinated project by the whole BRICS bloc. And what's their goal? To build a totally different kind of global order. And the ultimate goal here is to create what experts call a multipolar world order. So, what on earth does that mean? Well, like this slide says, it's about moving away from a world run by just one superpower, the United States, to a new system where power is spread out among multiple big players and different blocs. A total shift. And just so you know, this isn't some fringe theory or just political rhetoric. As this 2025 study from the European Scientific Journal shows, the rise of BRICS as a real challenge to the current system, well, it's a huge topic of study in international relations right now. Academics are all over it.
So what does this new vision actually look like in practice? Well, the BRICS nations have a pretty clear playbook. They are all against the Western sanctions on Russia, arguing they're illegal. They're busy building their own financial systems to get away from the US dollar, and they consistently push for talking things out, diplomacy, instead of military force to solve global problems.
To put it really simply, the academic research basically concludes that the BRICS bloc has become this major force, and it's actively trying to steer the world toward this new multipolar future.
All right, so after all that, where do we stand? We've seen cracks in the West, we've seen this balancing act from the giants in Asia, and we've seen the rise of this alternative bloc. It really feels like we're watching the end of an era and the beginning of a whole new global map being drawn.
Let's just quickly recap how we got here. It's like a ripple effect, right? We started with the core conflict, Russia versus Ukraine and the West. That exposed the cracks within NATO. Then we looked at the tightrope walk of giants like China and India. And finally, we saw how all of that feeds into the rise of this coordinated BRICS alternative. See how it all connects?
Okay, so if there's one thing to take away from all this, it's this. None of this is happening by accident. The different reactions we're seeing, whether from Turkey or India or China, these are all deliberate, calculated moves. These nations are putting their own interests first, and by doing that, they are directly challenging the world order that's been in place since the Cold War ended.
And all of that leaves us with one last big question to chew on. The old map is clearly being redrawn, and the old rulebook is being thrown out. So as the world keeps changing, the real question for the next decade is, who's going to write the new rules?